This is the Balancing Act by Security Compass, your guide to going fast while staying safe in today's digital world. Today we are joined by Rohit Sethi from Security Compass and Nicolas Chaillan, Chief Software Officer, U.S. Air Force, to gain insights into building a DevSecOps program for a large government organization. In this podcast, we will talk about the challenges, key considerations, and the need to balance security with fast delivery cycles in the defense world. We will also cover the program structures being established across the Department of Defense and understand more about the ATO process.
Okay, thanks. Hi, Nicolas. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your history, and the work you're doing with the Air Force?
Sure. Good morning, and thanks for having me today. I think it's pretty interesting to look at the background and why we've been bringing a CSO in the Air Force. I'm the Chief Software Officer of the Air Force. I'm also the co-leader of the DoD Enterprise DevSecOps Initiative. Obviously, you can tell with my French accent that I was not born in the U.S. I moved to the U.S. about 10 years ago now. I founded 12 companies, so I was lucky to start pretty young. At 15, I didn't go to college or anything. Obviously, creating companies and building different businesses and having employees is a different world out there when you do that at scale. And in 12 countries, I had offices in Latin America, in Canada, in the US, in Europe, and then Dubai. And I guess my background is really on the software side, cyber. I'm a developer myself, so I code in multiple languages, and I love building innovations. And so I built about 187 products over the last 15 years that I sold to about 40, 500. Very good at building IP and software and selling assets to companies and grow sales to a point where you can then take that and run with it by scaling through exits, and I had a great team to help me do that as well. And then I moved to the US, and after my 12th company, I wanted to try to make a difference. And so I started DHS. I was a chief architect at DHS with also special advisor for cyber with cyber.gov, and then started in the DoD first as the special advisor for cyber and DevSecOps at the OSD, and then now the chief software officer. It's been about a year and 5 months now that I've been the CSO.
That's pretty amazing. That's quite the background. So you don't hear about a lot of people who have, first of all, not a lot of people have been that successful. Of the few that have had a lot of strings of success from an entrepreneurial perspective, you don't hear of many that have gone to serve in the government as a way to give back. So I've always found that quite interesting and inspirational. Specifically, as we think about the CSO role, why did the Air Force create a Chief Software Officer role?
Yeah, at first, when Dr. Roper, who created the CSO role, came up with the idea, I was struggling because I want to do everything like we do it on the commercial side, and there's no such thing as a CSO in any organization on the commercial side yet, although I start to hear that there are several companies are thinking about doing a similar role. But so at first, I was not too excited about the title. But then I started to realize first the DoD and the Air Force is a little bit bigger, if not much bigger than most organizations out there, and both in terms of funding and number of people and the mission and impact. And so really, I think the vision behind it was to have a central focus point for all software impediments, issues, enterprise services, so we can build those at scale. And we can really help organizations and teams to move to DevSecOps, cloud, and remove, all the impediments in their way. But more importantly, also build enterprise services to be able to adopt things like DevSecOps and Kubernetes and containers. And so that's where having a central team to accredit and harden containers and build multi-tenant DevSecOps managed services, central repository for source code and containers, does make a lot of sense. In fact, that's really what is allowing us to move much faster than most organizations. And so the role is really about solving the adoption and the culture of the training. And I think the training piece is going to be what's going to define success for large organizations or small organizations, with continuous learning and enabling teams to keep up with the pace of relevance and giving them time and creating content that's not biased for one company or one cloud provider, and really keeping in mind the vendor lock-in aspect of things, which too often is dismissed without really understanding the impact for the long term of the mission. Right. And so that's what the CSO is about.
That's interesting. You mentioned organizational change and change management as being a key piece there. And I speak to people every day who are struggling to implement change in large organizations, particularly people who are trying to roll out agile programs, DevOps, DevSecOps. There's certainly the technical aspect of it, but there's a level of buy-in you need from the senior management in a company anyway, to be able to have these programs be successful. Can you talk a little bit, about what have you done to have people embrace so much change in such a large organization?
Yeah, I think we're lucky. We have the leadership with a push from the top to the bottom, but we also have great people that are pushing from the bottom too. So we're getting both pushes at the same time, which really helps getting things done. When I started, we already had Kessel Run doing great things and already pushing the boundaries of DevOps and now DevSecOps. And I think the critical piece was to really tie this back to the mission and explain why this mattered. And it's not just tech, it's really almost a critical component to make sure that we are successful. And I think there's a couple of pieces there. There's one, the timeliness aspect of being able to deliver at the right pace with the right baked-in security. That's really kind of the second big push there, which is the baked-in continuous monitoring, zero trust push we're doing to really have that a sense of baked-in security. And that's why people sometimes call it Tech DevOps instead of DevSecOps. I don't like it because security never comes first. You don't build software unless you're a cyber company, but usually don't build software just to be secure. You build software to innovate and bring capabilities to your end users. And sure, cyber is critical and important, and you want it to be there and baked in and into the process, but it's never the driver as to why you're doing things. And that's just short-sighted to start saying cyber is first. And never, ever would you sit down and say, oh, I'm going to just build my cyber stack first, and then let's see what I build next. Right. It just makes zero sense. First, you could not build a cyber stack if you don't know what you're building first, because it has to be based on what you're building and the technology you're building and how you're going to architect it. And so that baked-in cyber piece was really a big push. And so having that timeliness aspect and looking at how many times we failed to deliver, following a waterfall approach of 5-year delivery, where we spend billions and end up delivering something that just does not meet the requirements of the warfighter anymore, because we're not enabling that continuous learning and that continuous feedback from the end user to make sure that building something that makes even sense to build to begin with. When you define requirements 5 years ahead, unless you're someone like Elon Musk, I'm pretty sure you're going to be wrong, drastically wrong, and not just a little bit wrong. And by the time in fact, if you go and ask any program manager 5 years later, you're going to find them to say everything they had thought about is probably completely 80% at least different. The simple example of that is take your 5 years old cell phone, if you still have it, and go try to use it now. We'll see how happy you are in terms of user experience.
Yeah, no, that's a great analogy. And it's interesting. So you bring up the security and cybersecurity compliance needs. This is the sort of thing that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, and is really the theme of the podcast, which is that if you try to prioritize security and compliance in its own right without thinking about meeting the needs of the software you're building as a first priority, it tends to be an uphill battle. And so the idea of balanced development is this concept of making sure we prioritize getting software out to its end users, but doing so in a responsible way. So obviously in the world of defense, security and compliance are pretty key considerations, and you've talked about baking it in. At a really high level, what are some of the things that you guys are doing to approach balancing the competing demands of trying to get capabilities out to the ground as quickly as possible, but still trying to meet the security and compliance needs?
Yeah, I think what's always been interesting with my background is that I'm both a developer and a cyber guy. So I've always done this without even thinking about it too much in my companies in terms of finding that balance between too much security, not enough security, and or too much innovation too fast with not enough security. And so my approach was always compliance last and security first, right? Because compliance never really means security. And so while documentation does make sense and we need some documentation, I think that the key piece is really to have a cybersecurity that brings the top tier principles like zero trust, the behavior detection instead of basic CV scanning, automating as much as possible using GitOps. And so there are a lot of things we're doing that are removing the impediments to having even to think about cyber too much by using service meshes like Istio, decoupling things so the software inherits a lot of the cyber controls by using the platform layer and the service mesh layer. And then we end up having very little left to do. Less than 10% of the niche controls are left at the application layer. And so that already streamlines the process for the development teams, but at the same time, it is critical to have it as a baked in, and that's why I keep using baked in as a key term, because the reason why we pick Kubernetes, for example, is because we can inject that sidecar container stack into the platform. So it's always there, regardless as if the development team even thinks about cyber. I know I'm going to have my mutual TLS tunnels. I know I'm going to have my zero trust enforcement with Istio. I know I'm going to have my behavior detection. So if there's drift, that's going to be killing the container. We have this concept of moving target defense where we kill containers, we treat them like cattle. There are a lot of things we do that by definition, regardless of the quality of the developer or the software running on top of it, is going to mitigate a lot of the risk and the ability of the bad actor to move laterally across the system, both by using moving target defense and zero trust. And so I think once you start massively mandating this kind of key principles and left and right gates, you're left with a lot of flexibility when it comes to the development side, and you can now take more risk and try things out much faster, particularly when you move to microservices and you decouple your monolithic application, because another big risk for us when you put Kubernetes on jets and bombers and space systems, you don't want to, of course, the system at risk in terms of the airworthiness or nuclear surety of the system. So that's very critical, of course, that we have that coupling between the new features we bring and the airworthiness piece of the system. The two have to be decoupled. And so once you start really embracing these principles, you're allowed to take more risk, move faster, try things out, try new languages. You don't have to have that monolithic approach of moving everybody to the same language, same databases. So that gives you a lot of freedom, a lot of flexibility to try things out.
Cool. Yeah, that's a really innovative approach. Seems like it's the way the world is bound to go in general, trying to both bake in security as much as possible into the architecture of what people are building and ideally abstract it away from developers. You mentioned compliance coming as a last priority before security, which I think a lot of people buy into that philosophically. That unfortunately doesn't take the compliance burden away. In the space that you operate in now, if you could maybe just to help the listeners who are not familiar with the federal government and some of the things that you guys have to do, you talk a little bit about the ATO process and what is meant by continuous ATO. How have you innovated in that need?
Yeah, so the government has a process called Authority to Operate, an ATO, which is at least usually a very slow and manual process to make sure that the software can be authorized, right, in DoD systems at different classification levels and assess the risk and assess the delta between the mandated requirements and the state of the system, and understanding what's running on the system, port and protocol, all the ingress, egress. You're really looking at every piece of the system for compliance. So we use the NIST cybersecurity framework with the 853 controls. And based on the criticality of the system, you have more or less controls to follow. The continuous ATO that we created in the Air Force first, and now that's spreading up to the government, is a whole different process. There used to be also something called a fast track ATO, accelerated ATO. That is a whole other thing, which is more about automating that manual process. We went even beyond that with the continuous ATO because we created the concept of a software factory, which is really a DevSecOps pipeline, a CI/CD pipeline with gates. And we have three state of main gates. We have the change management gates, so stuff like how many eyes on code do you have to approve code change and do change management and enforcement, configuration management, all that kind of stuff through Git, through code. And then we have testing gates. So how many tests you have for unit testing, integration testing, end-to-end testing, and we mandate test coverage percentages. And then we have cyber gates with traditional static dynamic code analysis, fuzzing, container security scanning, bill of material, running knowing your dependencies and your bill of material, stuff like that. And then, so those are the gates of the pipeline. And if your software passes the gate, and that's your process, right? The process of that pipeline. Then, and if it's running on an approved platform, for us, we use Kubernetes. So we have to approve the Kubernetes distribution. It could be Rancher, it could be Convoy, it could be OpenShift, it could be VMware. Doesn't matter as long as they're approved at that classification level. If you have an accredited platform and then you have a CI/CD pipeline on top, approved, and your platform also includes the cyber stack we talked about. So for us, we call it the Sidecar container security stack, which is all open source, by the way. We put it all for free. For your listeners, they're going on software.af.mil. They can see inside the D document section, they can see all the architecture documents, all the container source code, the binaries, everything is open to the world. So anyone can reuse the entire stack we built. But the Sidecar stack brings zero trust, centralized logging, and behavior, continuous runtime detection, and CV scanning. And by having that running in your platform, we get the continuous monitoring and the centralized logs we need. And by having the process in the pipeline, you can then automatically pass those gates. And what comes out of the pipeline in terms of software is accredited, fielded to be deployed on the platform. And the last piece is you then authorize a team to use the platform. So for us, we have a team called Platform One. That's the DoD-wide team for DevSecOps. We don't mandate it, but people can come and use it as a managed service or have a dedicated instance of Platform One. And Platform One team then trains the new team coming on board. And all they have to do is to get the training, so they don't have to go and accredit the platform. They don't have to go and reinvent the process and the gates. They can just inherit all that and get started. And so we saved about 100 years of time in 1 year by moving to DevSecOps, by pushing initially 37 programs, now 60 plus programs to DevSecOps, which are really the largest weapon systems on the planet, with programs like F-35, GBSD, which is all the nuclear arsenal on the ground. So we're really touching very critical systems and multi-billion, if not trillion-dollar funding programs over 10 years. And so that is really how we end up saving about 12 to 18 months of time for every 5 years of time planned for per program. So that compounds to that 100 year of time, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah, I'd say. I, of course, know, but it'd be interesting for you to talk a little bit about how your work has inspired others, both in the DoD and beyond.
Yeah, first we were excited when we started to see a lot of different teams come and use, like I said, the source code and the containers. So we have what we call the Iron Bank, which is the centralized secure container registry where teams can go and consume our containers. And we have 80 plus companies pushing containers on Iron Bank and also a ton of open source software there. So anyone can go and consume that and use them. Of course, they still have to buy the license of the commercial products, but they get the hardened version, more secure version of these Lego blocks. And then we created a bunch of training, documentation, architecture documents, guidance that's now being used by about 12, federal agencies inside of DoD and companies too. I had multiple conversations with several financial institutions, healthcare institutions, retailers, you name it, countries outside of the US, from Japan to Canada to France to whatever. So it's pretty amazing. And then we have NIST that came to the table too with my friend Ron Ross to try to take this and make that a a series of NIST publications, special publications, to make that a kind of a government standard. They have a great publication already on Service Mesh, and now the goal is to do more like a DevSecOps one and more containers and Kubernetes publications. It's exciting to see how this is spreading. At the same time, the fact that we open sourced it and made it widely available for anyone to consume, I think was a big factor of that. We have the Terraform scripts. We work with all these Kubernetes distribution companies on the repo as well, so people can just download that and have a more secure version than what they would get if they would just go and download the upstream version. But yet we're not forking code, we're not cheating the system. It's all pushed back to the community and making us move faster, better, stronger together.
That's great. That's a great positive impact globally that you're making. Thinking about people who are setting up a DevSecOps program at their companies or large organization that they're dealing with, what advice would you give them if they were just starting today?
I think that the first thing that people need to realize is the larger the organization, the more reinventing the wheel you're going to have. When I started, we have dozens of teams building their own Kubernetes stack, their own CI/CD pipeline from scratch. And while you don't want to have a one-size-fits-all, you also don't want to have 50 million teams reinventing the wheel. So building an enterprise service like we've done with Platform One and Cloud One. Cloud One is our cloud office with Amazon and Azure. So multi-cloud, abstracted, no lock-in to cloud providers. So same identity across clouds. And then having a Platform One stack that has that baked-in security stack. But yeah, multiple options of containers. We have about 200 plus containers, 23 databases, 16 programming languages, you name it. We have a bunch of options, but yet we have the same cyber stack. We have the same logging capability. So a lot of the left-hand gates, we use GitOps with Argo CD to be able to have that GitOps mentality of everything is code. There's no drift in production, no one in production having commands to make changes. So it's all in code. So we're pushing a lot of the pretty advanced best practices. But by doing it centrally, we can then train people. We have this training program. We partner with the Linux Foundation, the CNCF, and O'Reilly, the books, to bring unbiased content on IT. We try to give an hour a day to our people to go and learn and keep up with the pace of relevance and have that continuous learning, self-learning. Because I don't believe that classes or anything that's not at broader scale is going to succeed, because first we have 100,000 people we have to train this year, but also we have different level of maturity. So having a self-learning capability is critical, where they can just go and have a cloud sandbox to put it to good use so they don't learn in a vacuum. So having that centralized team, to answer your question, where that team will provide all these services turnkey. And I guess whether you call it a CSO or chief software officer or not, having a very top reporting. I don't know if it's reporting to a CIO or if it's reporting to a CEO, CFO, CEO, I don't care. But the fact is, it is probably a very senior role, because for me, if I look at it and I put back my investor hat, I was an investor, and I know how to do that as well. I would probably now look at the maturity of the DevSecOps team of an organization to decide whether or not I'm going to invest in a company now, because that's going to determine if they can keep up and innovate in the next 3 to 5 years, or they're just going to get behind. And right. So the stronger the maturity in DevSecOps, the more likely they are able to react to change, react to events, learn rapidly, make changes. And no organization should undermine how important it is to use DevSecOps in 2020. But more importantly, for the government side, I would say it's borderline criminal, right? Not to use it in 2020, because we're just wasting taxpayer money, right? It's like bad use of the taxpayer money if we're not using it wisely and not using these kind of principles in 2020, when DevOps is now 10 years old, Agile 20 years old, is just not something that we should let happen.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. And one thing you talked about there is the chief software officer role again, which I think is quite interesting, and probably hopefully a trend we start to see increase. But in that discussion, one thing that we've noticed quite a bit is in most commercial organizations, the security rolls up to something like a chief information security officer who may roll up to a CIO or sometimes to audit or risk management and has a different reporting line. But typically the scope of what they do is all things security. And often a lot of the focus will be on things that are happening in the perimeter and phishing threats and these sorts of things and what's happening in their security operations center. And then you have a separate reporting line that goes to the either CTO or lines of business that often are in charge of software, and they don't specifically have security as part of their area of responsibility. And so what we often see is this idea of software security falling a little bit between the cracks, not really a primary responsibility of the CISO, not really a primarily responsibility of the CIO or CTO, even though maybe it should be. And so it often doesn't get the first level of focus that you would see with what you just described. Do you think that's a trend that's going to change? Do you think it's a chief software officer that's going to come and bring this together? Or do you think that's poised to continue to happen for a while, where security and software development are in different parts of the company?
Yeah, I guess it's also very well depend on the size of the organization. I think I would not have a CSO, chief software officer, not a chief security officer, because that's also another problem. We have CSO with two different meanings. Sure. Now, chief software and chief security. But I would not have a chief software officer in a small organization. You want to be lean, you want to be very aggressive. At the same time, it's almost a full-time job to build a DevSecOps stack and the right team and build a cybersecurity baked in. And it's hand in hand with the CISO, I guess. It's very difficult to have all these silos when we're trying to shift things left and move to DevSecOps, where everyone is part of the same team. The more of these C-level roles you have, the less likely it is that you're going to be coordinated and lean, and that just compounds the problem of having silos and struggling with adoption and coordination and all that kind of stuff. So it's a challenge, right? That's why I was never at first too excited about the CSO concept. But at the same time, I realized all the stuff we had to do and all the work we have to do to create all the good stuff we created in the Air Force and DoD now. But so I don't think I would have been able to do that without having a dedicated role just to focus on that, because now you're spread too thin and you have too many things to deal with. Now, of course, the title doesn't matter. That could have been under a CIO. On my side, on the acquisition side, that's where the funding is. That's very different. So it will be almost like the equivalent to reporting to a CFO on the commercial side, which is interesting, or maybe a COO, I don't know, but it's always a blurry line for the government. But I would say certainly trying to shift everybody left and have them be part of the same team. So I guess maybe to some degree having the same reporting. I don't like the CISO reporting to the CIO because they are competing interests. And that's back to your point on the balance, right, between cyber and innovation. The CIO has to innovate with the CTO. And same thing, right, is the CTO reporting to the CIO, the CTO reporting directly to the CEO. I don't think there is a rule for success. I think it's about how well people will work together. And I think at some point, it only makes sense if the organization is very large. I think the more you can cut and remove the silos and have the same reporting structure, regardless of title, I think the more likely you're going to succeed. Of course, being a C-level executive is great for people's ego. So that's another thing.
Yeah, of course. Okay, sounds good. Look, I appreciate all the insight today, Nicolas. Is there anything else you wanted to share with the listeners before we end today?
The one thing I wanted to share is, like I said, we open source our stack. And again, I'm going to repeat the link, software.ai.mail. It would be great, right, to have a two-way street, right? This is not a one-way partnership. So we have multiple organizations starting to share code with us, and really we can be stronger together and move faster together. And so anyone that's willing to contribute containers or look at the source code and improve, we're not saying everything is as secure as it could be, but I think there's plenty of room for improvements. And so if you see things, if you see some of the open source projects we open source and you want to join and contribute, that would be obviously very much appreciated.
Sounds good. We'll make sure that people know that and we get the word out that this is an open source community people can contribute to. Thanks so much for your time today, Nicholas. As always, really appreciate it and very insightful.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, thanks.
Can't get enough of the balancing act? Make sure to check out our website at www.securitycompass.com and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more episodes.